Hi, everyone. It's Lindsay Baker with the Action Hour. Today, my guest is Karen Sussman. She is president of the International Society to Protect Mustangs and Burros. And we have Karen here today with a very urgent message. Karen, what do you need to tell people today?
Lindsay, this is so critical to the future of all wild horses in our country. We must save the Heber wild horses in northern Arizona and make them a study herd of 5 to 7 years where their behaviors, all of their habitat and all of their wonderful actions will be studied. It's critical to the future of all wild horses. And this is a must. We must have everyone call Secretary Vilsack and ask him to do this. It's so simple. It's in the law. The law states that the secretaries have the authority to make a study area anywhere that they so choose to do. And this needs to be done immediately.
I want to jump right into a video to give people a little bit of background on what is going on.
We're a community that helps each other, that works together, and we're tired of being attacked over these horses.
A fight over horses, pitting neighbor against neighbor in the small community of Heber. Dozens of horses found shot to death in the last 3 years. And as ABC 15 investigator Sonu Wasu explains, it's a mystery now under investigation by federal authorities.
Small town that loves its horses.
Our mascot for our high school is a Mustang.
Is now known as the small town where dozens of horses have been found dead on forest land. 15 shot just in the last month.
This was a group shooting, complete man shot. And
well, animal advocates find it hard to stomach the sheer horror of a band of horses in the line of fire. Now, those who have been speaking out to defend the animals tell us they're getting harassed for protecting the horses. Veiled threats, social media messages warning them to keep their mouths shut.
Neighbors are against neighbors, friends are against friends, but you're afraid to even go out. I am carrying a gun, which I've never done before.
Animal advocates point the finger of blame at local ranchers, saying it's no secret. Cattle ranchers here have wanted the horses gone. They're a pest to their livestock and their livelihood.
they're bringing this awful image of our community, and we don't like that.
Kathy Gibson Boatman, an 8th-generation cattle rancher in the community, says local ranchers are fed up of seeing fingers of blame pointed in their direction.
I know with my whole heart and being that it's not ranchers killing these horses.
She stresses ranchers want the horses removed by the Forest Service, just like they have managed the population for generations, with controversial roundups that are now blocked by a federal court since animal advocates filed a lawsuit.
Prior to this love affair with this herd of horses, they would gather the horses, they would round them up, they would sell them, and they would slaughter them.
Boatman, who is speaking for ranchers in her community, says she wants to make it clear they don't want to see horses shot to death.
No, because there are laws that say that you can't do that. But unfortunately, our own history has shown us when the law, the authorities don't do the proper thing, unfortunately, sometimes people take vigilante justice.
So what's the U.S. Forest Service doing about it? A spokesperson tells me since January, they've deployed additional law enforcement and equine experts to Heber to investigate these horse deaths and collect evidence.
I mean, they're a little, a day late and a dollar short here.
So who's killing the Heber horses?
We have a sociopath who's in our town.
The Forest Service is now offering a $5,000 reward for information that'll lead to an arrest.
Karen, couple things they said there, that she was roundups. For people that are not familiar with what happens in a roundup, it sounds like a pretty benign thing. The horses get round up, they go to adoption. Can you explain really what happens in a roundup?
Well, in a roundup, what happens is the whole family band structures are disrupted. And when you disrupt family band structures, you absolutely destroy the integrity of these highly social evolved animals. These animals evolved on the North American continent 60 million years ago. They have been here. They know how to continue to adapt to their environment. They were around at the time of the woolly mammoth, and they were around with the saber-toothed tiger. They are a native species to this continent. What is important also to understand is that cattle are not native to this continent. And consequently, you can just put 2 and 2 together to see who best fits into the ecosystem. So, and it's important to understand that once these animals are removed and disturbed and their families are disturbed, they may never be the same again. If we were to go into a community, which is what a herd is a community of bands together that live happily and peacefully. If we're to go into a community of people and then randomly take different parts of families in that community, let's say we went into a home and we took the father, maybe the mother, and maybe the teenagers were left to be there and to be able to protect their families. You can imagine what would happen socially to the disruption of this community. It would no longer be functioning as a very evolved community. It's the same thing with wild horses. We cannot destroy family bands, which is what happens every time they go in and do these gathers. And so, you know, when they go to the adoption program, that is wonderful. In fact, in some cases, that is how I got involved in the Wild Horse and Burro program, is I adopted my first horse back in 1981. So I went over to see her, and she was only 18 months old, just a baby, but she was big. And you have to remember, she was born in 1980 when wild horses were not so disrupted and their bands were so evolved that they are magnificent animals. They tell you so much. And so I ended up bringing her home, and she is the gal that transformed my life. And from that point on, after adopting her, I committed my entire life to saving wild horses. And so, yes, that in that way, the adoption program works. And if the BLM would manage the adoption program the way they're supposed to manage the adoption program, this could be a wonderful benefit for everybody.
We want to just remind people that in 1971, and it's quite ironic that it was 50 years ago, there was an act passed to protect the wild horses and barrows. That was in 1971, the Wild Horse and Barrow Act. And after that, there was a study that was supposed to take place. And can you go into a little bit of the history of how this all evolved?
They must be studied. They must complete what they never completed back in 1983, which was a study that it actually came out of Public Rangelands Improvement Act. It was a requirement, a law that gathered the National Academy of Sciences together to be able to study wild horses and understand their true nature as a wildlife species. BLM, when they reported back to Congress, they were supposed to report back by 1983, said that they didn't feel like they could afford to do this. So consequently, they never did this study on understanding wild horses as wildlife. So they have spent $50 million every year on these holding, $50 to $60 million every year on these holding pastures. Imagine if they would take that money, $50 to $60 million, and actually manage the habitat, which is what they're supposed to do. The BLM is a land manager. They're supposed to manage the habitat. Imagine in this climate crisis that we're in right now, if they put that money to good use to be able to protect the habitat. But I can tell you that in the 100 years or so that we've been monitoring habitat, it is in a static trend. It is not any better than it was 100 years ago, pretty much so. And
isn't it? It's probably worse.
And taking wild horses off does not correct it.
Right now, these are the 3 critical areas of focus, and maybe you should just reiterate those for everyone.
Well, we feel that if the Honorable Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, would declare the Heber horses a study area, it truly would transform how these animals are managed. Because the thing that I want to just briefly talk about that herd is the fact that they are on 300,000 acres of land in northern Arizona, Apache Sitgraves Forest. On those 300,000 acres of land, we filed a lawsuit back in 2006 to stop them from removing all of those horses. At that time, there were 300 to 400 wild horses in the area there. Today, they did a count last year, there's only 450 wild horses. So what that tells me, it emphasizes what we have learned from managing our own Gila herd, that those, if you leave them alone and leave their band structures intact, they self-regulate their numbers. And if you look at the Gila herd, they could even be almost at a zero increase or as minimum as 3%. And the thing that the BLM tells us every day and tells the American public for the last 35 years, horses double every 4 years. Horses' growth rate is 20% every year. Okay, so we calculated what that would be in the 15 years that the Heber herd has been, by law, telling them that they cannot remove these horses until a territory plan is done. There would be 4,800 horses, according to BLM's model. So that should just wake up everybody right now that, managing horses as, by leaving them alone, and the law states it, minimal feasible management is what the law requires of the BLM. And using birth control and constantly disrupting their family bands every 4 years is maximum management and is destroying the herds.
And why do you think it is that the BLM continues along this pathway?
Oh my God.
Why would they, after you present and have presented on so many occasions the facts, reports, scientific studies, not just from your organization with all, you're amazing, but other sources as well. Why are they not paying attention?
Well, I think if you really look back at the history of the BLM, Lindsay, you're going to understand that the agency was a livestock agency. Prior to around the 1930s, they were called the grazing agency. During that time as a grazing agency, they were hell-bent on killing every wild horse on public land. So it's a cultural attitude. That attitude persists in the BLM to today. It hasn't changed because they favor livestock over wild horses. But when you think about it, imagine an agency that is in charge of a program that is to protect and preserve wild horses because 96% of the population wants wild horses. It crosses every social, political, religious divide in the whole United States. If anything connects us together, it's the wild horses. But imagine putting the BLM, which they had to do back in 1971, in charge of management and protecting wild horses. To me, it's like putting the fox in the hen house. I think that when you think that the money involved within the public lands ranching program, first of all, we have to understand that $500 million every year is subsidized to the ranchers. And, if we really just cut out that subsidy, imagine what we could do for the environment. The other thing that everybody has to understand, that public lands ranching is different than private ranching.
When people say that it's a matter of money and saving money, that what is going on is costing more money and it's totally illegal, it's totally wrong, and yet it continues, but we can change it by making that phone call, by writing that letter. Craig is an ecologist and he says, yes, spend for their water and do positive PR about all the good that wild horses and burros do to restore the ecosystems and combat global warming. So that's another point that's super important.
Well, we know that the Heber horses have already prevented any fires from the original fire, the Chudesky Rodeo fire back in 2003, because they just had a fire up on Heber. And of course, I monitor that area every day when there's fire. There were so many fires in Arizona. But it was interesting that the fire was not anywhere on the Heber area where the wild horses are, because they managed to graze the system and keep it within, any amount of fuel for the fire. So the fires were outside the areas. And to me, that's very interesting. The other thing is, if you note that in the area, wild horses are very conservative. It has been my experience in all of this time to note that they never graze more than 20 minutes in one area and they're moving again. So it's very unlike cattle grazing. When you watch them, they're camped out in an area until there's not one blade of grass left on that area. And they also camp out around water sources. And so wild horses don't do that. Whereas if you drive in the West, Lindsay, you will see cattle standing in the water during a very hot day. You know, very rarely do you see wild horses. They will go in and they'll bathe themselves and put mud packs on them so to keep the flies off. But you'll see cattle are just totally different.
Would you like to run through some of your slides? Go ahead and talk about the slide, that beautiful horse that we see there.
What we're asking Secretary Vilsack to do is to declare. That's all he has to do. It just has to be a phone call. He can just call the Forest Service. And I've had this experience in the past with 2 previous secretaries of the Interior. They were very accommodating to ISPMB. But we have had such difficulty in the last 3 months trying to get to Secretary Vilsack. So we're asking everybody to call his office and ask that he declare the Heber herd in northern Arizona a study herd for the next 5 to 7 years, because we believe it will transform how the government manages wild horses, and it will absolutely stop in the tracks all of this talk about the 20% birth rate doubling every 4 years. So I think it's going to be critical. But what's most important about this is that this study area is not done by the Forest Service or the BLM. We must have an independent group who is approved by ISPMB, and so that we know that they're leading ecologists in the world about wild horses, leading behaviorists and habitat specialists. And too many times you get within the government itself, too many times you have people that already have an agenda, and that is to remove wild horses. So I think that's really important that we have an independent study group, and we're trying to work on that as we speak right now to get an independent study group. I mean, if we use BLM's model, which is what they use, we should be counting 4,800 horses there right now. And what I want to say is that the BLM has been doing this for the last 35 or 40 years because they've never wanted to manage wild horses. So they have this advertising programs that horses are overpopulating the American West. That is not truth. That is absolutely not true. And so we just have to counter that. And this herd is what can be done to counter it. They're saying that by 2030, that there's going to be over 1 million wild horses roaming western rangelands. And just to add to this, Lindsay, I want people to understand that when the act passed and they first started counting horses in 1974 and burros, they counted 60,000 wild animals, 60,000. And they want to reduce them to an arbitrary number of 26,000 something. And that isn't, when the law said that they were fast disappearing from the American West, we have to remember at one time there was upwards to 2 million wild horses. To say that they're overpopulating now is not true, because their population is about the same as it was in 1974. The government has not appropriated the land that they should have. They have a rightful area to where they are found in their herd area. Originally, there was 46 million acres that they were supposed to be on. And the law states that those acres still belong to the wild horses. So they haven't lost the acres, they've lost horses on the acreage. And that's another key point that we have to understand. So we might be able to get some of that acreage back again. So the way horses leave, there's many ways. Number one, they're adopted out. They're removed every 4 years. We have stats on that of all of the adoptions that the government has done. And you know that more horses seem to be in holding areas that now exist on public lands, which is not right. And for the most part, this has been going on since I've been in the program since 1981. I became president in 1993, but I worked for ISPMB all those years, and we watched in the Del Rio investigation, the peer report, which shows that government agents knew that they were selling wild horses out the back door. I can tell you that they had set up satellite adoption areas, they call them satellite areas. And so the livestock inspectors would just kind of turn their head when wild horses were gathered, and many of these horses went to these satellite places here, not branded.
Just a minute, I do have to invite the Bureau of Land Management on it. Anything, come on anytime and give their side of the story, as well as any other individuals that we are mentioning at this time. And I do want to mention that we do have a New York Times article about the so-called adoption/slaughter.
I can tell you that when we were involved way back in 1997, and this New York Times article just came out recently, that we knew that there were a lot of animals going directly to slaughter from the fields. And that Del Rio investigation never came to fruition, and not one shred of evidence was ever heard in that trial, and that was going on for 5 years. And at that time, I know that the 6 law enforcement agents invited me to come and meet with them, and I had no idea what they asked me to do. But I decided that I had an excellent connection with the BLM, and I knew that once I took the BLM on, that I would become their enemy, which is what happened. And but we held a big summit in 1996 in New Mexico, where we brought all the humane groups together. And through that, there were 7 leading articles by Martha Mendoza, who won a Pulitzer Prize for her work on looking at the corruption within the program. But I want people to understand that it was shut down, and they can read the peer report, which if they go to our site, they can just click on the peer report and look at that entire report. It's damning. And so what BLM was supposed to do during this time frame was to make sure that they shored up their adoptions, to make sure that they would no longer allow horses to go to slaughter. So they never did do that, and it's been difficult. So it's been very important that that we monitor those adoptions. And the BLM came up with this great idea, give somebody $1,000. It's cheaper than keeping them in the holding corrals. Well, the cheapest thing that they can do is keep them on public lands. I want to emphasize that first. But in doing the $1,000, a lot of people take advantage of this and say, hey, I'll keep them for a year, and then I'm going to turn around and sell them for slaughter. That wasn't the intent of the law.
That's so incredible that people are actually, I have to stop you there because this infuriates me. I cannot believe that, and that it's knowledge. I've heard this before. The New York Times did an article. There's been many things written about it. These horses are going to slaughter, folks. These beautiful animals are being pulled off their land, captured. Their whole lives are disrupted, their families are torn apart, and they're taken off to concentration camps and slaughtered for their meat. I was showing your website here, not your website, but your Facebook page, and people can get in touch with you. They can also donate through there. But the most important thing that they can do right now is make that phone call. Is that correct? I mean, that's going to help the most.
That's critical. Just getting out to Secretary Vilsack and making sure that they do not remove this herd, that they keep it a steady herd. I can't begin to emphasize how critical that really is, and how very important it will transform how wild horses are managed. I mean, I have the experience of 17 years of doing this, so I know, and I know that herds, even when they're giving the best of everything, they only increase at 8 and 9%, and that's a picture of our herd right there. And in the wild, when they're not taken care of, I would imagine that the growth rate would be close to 4%. I believe in the National Academy of Sciences, before they did any studies, they thought it might be at 7%. But I do believe that it's going to mimic the growth rate of the Heber herd, which is somewhere around 3 and 4% right now. They need to stay on public lands. They don't need to come off. They don't need birth control. They self-regulate. They do this all on their own because of their wisdom that they've carried through eons of time over this landscape. Wisdom that is passed on from one generation to another. Can you imagine if you go in and remove these horses every 4 years, how much wisdom is going to be left in these horses? We must stop this. We must stop this.
We see in these pictures here, the horses are in their social structure. They actually are, these are young males, I think it said, yeah. That are kind of playing together, and here they're mock fighting. So that you can see they actually, as you're saying, they are family units. And then we have this beautiful picture here. I mean, it's right there in front of your eyes to see, as opposed to this and this. This is a travesty. This is incredible. We have to do something right now. We have to do everything we can. And Karen, you are the guardian goddess to me, that you are the person that we should be listening to right now. You are the person we need to follow here and follow your lead, because this is critical. And as you say, it not only affects this herd, it affects the entire population of wild horses in barrows, because as this continues to happen, there are roundups going on. As we know, the Onaqui herd has been rounded up. People are putting up pictures on Facebook, heartbroken, watching and tracking these horses. And that's one good thing we do have. We do have social media on our side to keep track and to keep on top of these people and let them know we are watching you and we know what's going on and we want answers.
And Lindsay, I really believe that the one real way that we can stop the government is by making this herd a study herd, because when they realize that their increase is so little, that there's not 4,800 horses out there, that there is just only 450, and they have self-regulated over this time. They have not destroyed their habitat. They have not destroyed their habitat over this time. I think it's critical that we need to do this, because BLM has, for the past 35 years, had this program and of telling everybody there's an overpopulation. And the sad thing is, many people buy into it, that there's an overpopulation. And as I said from the beginning, if we started out with 50,000 animals, at least, and undercounted by maybe 50%, then how can we say there's an overpopulation now? And that gets into a whole different field of where we're going to go if we have to file another lawsuit against the Forest Service, which we will do, and which I will say will be quite costly for us. But it's going to be critical that hopefully Secretary Vilsack, through the goodness of his heart, will indicate that this is a study herd. This is what the people want. This is what the people want, Secretary Vilsack. They want you to declare this herd a study herd, because it will transform